saved, but the offer's only good for 2 weeks.
Wow.
People can easily be tricked by that, especially if they're desperate enough. And then if they read some letters from people who, whether the letters are real or not, gained something from this. They watch the healing lines and they see people fall over and they make the conclusion, wow, must be the power of God. So they're drawn in. It's a very seductive thing.
It's one of the questions I wanted to ask you. How do you account for the persistence of this fraud? If you just look back over the past 30 years, some of the biggest scandals in American life have involved these televangelists who have fallen. Ted Haggard, Jimmy Swaggart, Jim Baker. You could go on and on. Some of them have been exposed by investigative reports as just frauds, people who lie deliberately in order to bilk people out of their money. And yet the industry is bigger than it's ever been. How do you account for that?
You want to know why I think the thing perpetuates itself? Because Satan hasn't died. The counterfeit religion, he's disguised as an angel of light, and his ministers are disguised as angels of light, Paul says. As long as there's Satan, there's going to be false religion. The thing that saddens me is that the church, quote unquote, the evangelical church, has accepted it. Who's rising up to say anything about it? Who's openly condemning it? When I started writing those blogs, and you've been a tremendous help in those, my goal was to say to the world, this is not Christianity. This is not Christianity. This is a fraud. I think the world knows that, but they don't hear Christians say that. They wouldn't expect to hear Christians say. They think we're in collusion with each other. If you just put it all together, people in America would think that Christians are people who are in this wacky prosperity gospel and are rabidly right-wing politically. And that's how they would define us. There's nothing about the cross of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, and the glorious gospel of grace, and there's nothing about humility and sacrifice and unselfishness. And so my hope was that we could stir up some action and that the world would pick it up. I need to say this to the church, but I think even more so in the defense of true Christianity and the true gospel, it needs to be said to the world. So I'm going to take every opportunity that the Lord gives me openly and publicly to condemn this. I will take whatever platform comes, and I'm ready to openly condemn this and to say this is not true Christianity. These are not Christian people. This is a satanic fraud and deception. And it's the simple old story. Satan is a deceiver. And wherever you see a counterfeit, there's something of value or the counterfeit has no point. But you just have to get past the counterfeit to the real thing. And that, to me, has been the saddest part of the evangelical movement today. It's unwillingness to unmask the deceivers in the midst.
Yeah, that, I think, is one of the central and strongest points you've made in your blog posts, that it's really a mystery why it's so difficult to mobilize Bible-believing Christians to stand up and say, this is a fraud. In fact, I'm sure a lot of well-meaning, genuine Christians actually give money to support this kind of stuff.
Well, sure they do. And then you've got pastors who shouldn't be pastors. They obviously don't know what the Bible teaches about these things. They don't examine the Scriptures, or if they do, they don't have the conviction and the courage to speak up against it because they don't want to be seen as unloving and they don't want to ruffle anybody's feathers. And think about it. Think about the nature of the church. The market-driven, emerging, whatever you want to call it, church does not want to offend anyone, right?
Right.
I mean, anyone. They don't want to offend anybody. So you're not going to go to your average seeker-friendly church and hear an expose of the phonies in the prosperity gospel. You're not going to hear that. You're not going to hear any sound doctrine either. So the people who are in the church aren't going to have the criteria to evaluate those things. And if the pastors don't rise up against this stuff, why should the people?
Seems like the activist pastors are involved with other things, protesting abortion and so on.
Yeah.
All right, now back to Peter and Jude. Peter and Jude both talked about the greed that drives false teachers. The other thing that both of them speak about is the fleshliness of false religion. How often false religion goes hand in hand with the most gross kinds of immorality. And you see that same trend in televangelism, don't you?
We absolutely do. First of all, they have nothing to restrain the flesh. There is no power in the flesh to restrain itself, right? Self-reformation, trying to be a good person does not work. It ultimately turns you into a greater devil. So there's nothing in the fallen person's heart, soul, mind that can defeat the flesh. Okay? So he's going to have to battle with the flesh. But why are you going to battle with the flesh if you are living this cushy, plush, indulgent life? You're indulging. You have crossed the Rubicon of true reformation, even if you're a non-believer, when you said, I'm going to divest all these destitute people of their money to make myself rich. I mean, you're so evil at that point that, fornication or adultery or pornography or whatever other kind of corruption isn't some kind of far cry. But that's not an issue with them because that's not part of the deal. Sanctification, holiness, it's not part of the deal. It's not what they preach. It's not what they've lived. They haven't propagated it. They don't make it an issue. And you've got unregenerate teachers and pastors and unregenerate people coming together. That's not an environment in which holiness is going to flourish. So you got to come to terms with it. You got to live with it. And I mean, look at Tiger Woods. That's a classic illustration of a guy who wanted to appear moral but was so corrupt that when they finally discovered it, they can't even find the bottom of this hole that he lived. And, all I could think about was false teachers. That's how they live. This is nothing new, nothing shocking. What is shocking is the acceptance of this in the greater evangelical community. If we would draw the curtain on this, if evangelical leaders who know better would rise up and take a stand against this, we could distance ourselves from it. You're not going to end it because that's how evil people are going to function. But we could rescue the true church out of this chaos.
You, in your early article, you talked about the energy evangelical movement has put into making manifestos and declarations about social issues and things like that, and how comparatively we've been silent on this issue of false teaching. What do you think the long-term effect of that is going to be on the evangelical movement?
It's just going to continue to spell confusion, chaos in the face of the world. I think, as I've said, the big issue is the world, the non-converted people, look at the media presentation of Christianity, and they have to conclude that it is a scam. It's nothing short of criminal kind of conduct. I mean, that would be, if I were an unbeliever, I would just turn on television, and if I were to watch, say, Benny Hinn and whoever comes after him, Robert Tilton or whoever else, Kenneth Hagin, Kenneth Copeland, on and on, I would say, who would believe this? Who would believe this guy could heal people? Who would believe he could sit in a studio and say there's somebody out there, with a broken right arm, you're going to be healed. There's somebody out there with a tumor in your chest, you're going to be healed. When he made the tape 3 months ago, who's he talking to? Who would believe that? And do I think they believe that? No. When Benny Hinn claims to have raised dead people, do I think he really believes he raises dead people? He knows he doesn't raise dead people. Go to the hospital. Go to the morgue. Go to the next funeral. You want to be a hero? Go to a funeral. Raise the dead person. So I think the biggest fallout of this is the tragic misrepresentation of Christianity that is out there in the world. The second great tragedy is the utter lack of understanding of sound doctrine in the church. If you have to accept this, then doctrine can't be an issue. If we're going to allow for this and embrace this and say these are great people, wonderful people, doctrine can't be an issue. And if doctrine isn't an issue, then you've got an immature, uneducated, undiscerning church. And what happens with them? They can't discern. They're going to die of 1,000 heresies.
Among the side effects of the prosperity gospel, I think one of the worst, as you've pointed out, is that it focuses people on material prosperity and earthly success, physical health, things like that, which are all earthly and temporal issues. And Scripture commands us not to focus on things like that, but to set our affections on heavenly things. Why don't you wrap this up for us, John, by giving us the biblical gospel in a nutshell, and talk about how a true understanding of the gospel would focus our minds on things above.
I think those who are listening to this discussion probably understand the biblical gospel. But let's start where the biblical gospel starts. It doesn't offer health, doesn't offer wealth, doesn't offer success, doesn't offer a better marriage, doesn't promise you're going to get bumped up a few notches in your job, doesn't promise you're going to hit more home runs and straighten out your slice. The gospel doesn't promise any of these things. What the gospel promises is deliverance, salvation, rescue from the consequence of sin, which is eternal damnation in hell. The gospel is not about rescuing you from an undesirable condition in life. It's not about, as I heard one prosperity preacher say, if you send me your money, the Lord has told me you're going to find a perfect partner to marry. This is ridiculous. The gospel is not about providing any material blessing or any material benefit, except that the Lord will provide what you need. My God shall supply all your needs according to his riches by Christ Jesus. It doesn't promise any more than that. And maybe what you need most is persecution, suffering, and those kinds of things too. They're there as well. But what the gospel does promise is that you will be rescued permanently forever from the consequence of your sin, which is eternal punishment in hell, the judgment of God. And as a temporary benefit, you will in this life be loved and cared for and provided for and granted peace and grace and mercy and joy and blessed fellowship in the church as a part of the gift of salvation. That's really the short-term benefit. Short-term benefit in this life are all the wonderful things that we enjoy: love, grace, peace, the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance, all those things. All the benefits of being in the church, all the benefits of being led by the Spirit of God, of having answered prayer, of having protection and guidance and all of that in this life. That's the short-term benefit of salvation. But the real benefit, the long-term benefit, is eternal glory and the escape from eternal judgment. And the way to this is not by sending your money to anybody. It is by repenting of your sin and embracing Jesus Christ as Lord and understanding that he died on the cross as a substitute in your place to pay the penalty for your sin and rose again as affirmation from God that he had accomplished that substitutionary work. That's the true gospel.
Well, thank you for that, John. And all of that serves as an excellent introduction for two hard-hitting messages you taught a while back that are very timely for what's happening these days. We're calling this two-part series Toxic Television, a biblical answer to the prosperity gospel. And to our listeners, I know you're going to benefit from this. This is an in-depth biblical analysis and critique of the issues John and I have just been discussing. It's going to give you biblical truth that I think will help arm you to recognize and refute the outrageous practices that are going on in the name of Christ. And with that said, here's John MacArthur with Toxic Television, a biblical answer to the prosperity gospel.
The subject is the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel. We can title this message with a question: does God promise health and wealth? One of the most unusual legacies of World War II has been what are known as the cargo cults of the South Pacific. Anybody who lives in Australia or New Zealand knows about them. Many Aboriginal island people, ranging from northern Australia to Indonesia, were first exposed to modern civilization through the Allied armed forces during World War II. The American military, in particular, often used these remote islands in the South Pacific as sites for temporary landing strips and supply depots. Some of you will even remember, and some of you will remember your history books and be reminded of the fact that we were all over the South Pacific on remote little islands with our landing strips and our supply depots, so that we could keep our men in the air particularly. And so when Americans and other allies came to these little islands and met these Aboriginal island people, they came bringing cargo. They flew in there, created these airstrips so they could fly larger equipment in there, and then they brought in huge warehouses full of cargo, and they left as quickly as they came when the war ended. The tribal people had absolutely no opportunity to learn the ways of civilization, but for a brief moment they saw high technology up close. Cargo planes would swoop in from the sky, they would land